Hi, Patrick. So I really feel that this discussion is probably one of the most relevant or interesting discussions that at least my generation should have. It's the decision maybe on what to do in North America regarding China. And I think to make, because I do believe we haven't made a decision yet. We're exploring still how to handle that. Maybe some people in America already make a decision, and that's gonna be my first question, the perception of Americans about China. But I truly believe that decision that we're gonna make in the next 2 or 3 years regarding supply chains first with China, and then maybe other demographics and other decisions will impact in one way or another China. And Patrick, you have been doing a lot of research through a company or through many companies. And I know for sure you have some definitions or even decisions on your end on China. So, I mean, let's start on why you decided, I don't know, maybe 5-6 years ago to start looking into that.
Well, the book was written a lot more quickly than that. I like to joke that the book came out of the failure of being an Apple reporter at the Financial Times rather than the success of it. And what I mean by that is it wasn't a bunch of ideas that I'd already written and then sort of padded them out to make a book. It was a realization, I think this is the summer of 2022, 23, where I realized I really didn't know how Apple made its products. I mean, the back of the phones don't anymore, but they used to say, designed in California, made in China. So everyone knew that part, but who were they working with? What sort of investments were taking place, et cetera? And how did Apple react when Xi Jinping came to power and took China in a very different direction? These were answers that I really didn't know. And then what I came to understand by talking to operators and manufacturing design engineers of the company, I think I just found them absolutely staggering. So the two numbers that will forever be associated with the book are that Apple, since 2008, has trained 30 million people in the supply chain. So bigger than the labor force of Canada, bigger than the labor force of California. And when Apple sort of comes under pressure in 2015 in China, where they worry they're going to be the next Facebook, the next Google that is blacklisted in the country, they do their own supply chain study and realize that they're investing $55 billion a year into China.
$55 billion a year, just one company into China for that. Well, training and all the...
Yeah, training, machinery, and some of the construction.
For how many years?
Well, that was just 1 year. And then they realized, in a sense, the political capital benefits of what it meant to report that sort of internally through private meetings to Beijing. So, Xi Jinping comes to power in March 2013, and within 36 hours of him coming to power, Apple gets attacked by CCTV, the state-sponsored CNN, if you will, of China. And Apple is sort of flailing in its response. It doesn't really understand why it's under pressure. And it's really because they had these gargantuan operations, but there was no factory that said Apple or had a bitten fruit outside, right? And so they were operating under the radar. And the thing that people didn't know, and in fact I didn't know when I was an Apple reporter, is that Apple doesn't just sort of come up with designs in California and then send them to factories in China already capable of performing what Apple needs them to do and then sort of sends them back. Apple sends engineers literally by the plane load over to hundreds of factories across China to sort of get everybody up to speed, and if necessary, purchase the machinery in the billions of dollars in the aggregate to actually get that all done. So again, the numbers can just be staggering. So there was 2 times, one in 2014, one in 2016, where Apple convinced United Airlines to begin flying nonstop from San Francisco to 2 different Chinese cities that they'd never operated in, and basically said, we need you flying there 3 times a week nonstop. And even if the rest of the plane is empty, it won't matter. We will buy so many first-class seats that it'll be profitable for you.
Is there any company that, besides Apple, that you can compare, I mean, the size and the impact that they had in China on this training. Is there any other?
No, nothing like it. I
Nothing.
mean, when I would talk to someone that worked at, say, Motorola in 2010 or on the Pixel team for Google, they would say, every once in a blue moon, they would go to China and everybody else in first class would work for Apple. So there's that. The other staggering statistic is, I stole this from Shannon O'Neill, who I think spoke here once, from CFR.
Yep.
And she says that between the signing of NAFTA in 1994 to 2020, American and Canadian businesses invested some $250 billion into Mexico.
That's the stock of the last 30 years in Mexico. Yeah.
Apple pledged to invest $275 billion just between 2016 and 2021 solely in China.
Yeah.
So you can't look at corporate comparisons. You have to look at government efforts. And even government efforts don't necessarily get you there. So for instance, the CHIPS Act, right? President Biden's flagship act to fabricate chips in America, that was $53 billion over 4 years. So Apple, if you like, is doing a CHIPS Act in America's biggest adversary every year. So, I mean, I really struggle to comprehend the very things I was learning to such an extent that I kind of broke into tears in the middle of Manhattan when the New York Times review of the book came out, because they said in a more explicit fashion the subtext of the book that wasn't quite stated, which was that Apple hasn't just built up competitors to its own business. It's actually put the United States, if not the entire Western world, at risk because the capabilities, the manufacturing superiority in China for high-end electronics, but also, quite frankly, for drones and military weaponry, is just unsurpassed. It'll take forever for us to catch up. I don't know that we ever can.
And we talk about this before the session, but I mean, in defense of Apple, they made a decision 25 or 20 years ago when it wasn't just Apple, it was the US deciding to go ahead, allowing China to get into the WTO because it was beneficiary for the US.
Yes. So if it sounds like I'm maybe attacking Apple or I'm too anti-Apple, this is where I score the points that say I'm actually very pro-Apple in certain respects. Apple is nearly bankrupt in 1996, in 1997, and again in 2000. They are not the company we know today in the period when they begin to outsource and offshore. In fact, Apple is the last holdout. In the late 90s, they are the only American company trying to build everything in America. That's how the company was founded, two guys named Steve in a garage in 1976. And they're basically outcompeted, not in terms of the capability of the individual computer, not in terms of the graphical user interface, but in terms of how to manufacture at scale and run global distribution and logistics. IBM, Compaq, Dell, Gateway, all these computer companies just did better than Apple, and Apple struggled to compete and was nearly bankrupt, again, 3 different times. So when Apple goes to China, they are late. But in the same way that they are late to MP3 players, but they create the iPod, they are late to smartphones, but they create the iPhone. They are late to China, but they discover what's possible in China. They sort of, it's a success of imagination. Yeah. They're able to understand that we don't just have low cost and abundant labor here, we have an ability to recreate how products are going to be built. So they're like anti-automation in a certain sense. They're building things in a way that's automation unfriendly because they recognize the capacity of what China can build. And they end up orchestrating just like huge industrial clusters that require hundreds of thousands of people operating on Apple items, frankly, only sometimes for 8 to 12, 16 weeks at a time. And it's all off balance sheet. And so it works wonders for Apple. But my point here is that, Apple, like everyone else, was actually sort of encouraged by Washington at the time to create these links. And I don't hold that position in bad faith, or I don't hold anyone to account for that per se. I mean, one could, but my point is that America had sort of played a starring role, turning West Germany, Japan, Taiwan, Korea from authoritarian countries in various ways to middle classes with thriving democracies. America thought we could do the same thing with China. So there were solid reasons for that.
Yeah. You mentioned Apple sending not just to outsource things, the manufacturing, but the technical people from US to the manufacturing line, and I want to ask you if this idea of Trump administration we discussed Rob Lighthizer saying, well, we lost the innovation in America. We lost that edge because we lost the manufacturing line, the capacity of the workers in a factory, looking into the product and become better. That makes the point, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you think of something like Teach for America, this organization founded by Wendy Kopp, I want to say about 20 years ago. It really, rekindled a sort of like sexiness into going into teaching, right? Yeah. People coming out of Harvard or MIT or Princeton would want to go spend 2 years teaching. We need something like that for manufacturing. I mean, it's looked down upon in America, like it's not a job with an abundant future. And yet it absolutely could be. I used to live in Germany where it actually does have that appeal, right? Going off to work at BMW has a real appeal. I would love to see more of that in America. And actually, if there's one thing that I think the Trump administration should be asking of Apple, it's to invest in massive education programs. I think Apple, frankly, owes it to us. They've made the commitments anyway. They're kind of nonsensical commitments, but this would be a tangible thing that they could actually do. And if someone in the audience is familiar, I mean, Apple actually has done this in Detroit, but the scale is phenomenally small once you consider that they have done vocational training for 8 million people in China. That's in addition or separate from the earlier figure I cited about how many people they've trained in manufacturing.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning Teach for America. At the U.S.-Mexico Foundation, we let's say, co-founded Enseña por Mexico. That is the same model.
Yeah, you're in Teach for Mexico.
Yeah. Wendy Kopp has been here many, many times. Anyway, Patrick, you mentioned to me before the Apple is squeeze, you call it like a squeeze model with the suppliers in China. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's this stunning statistic. I would say this is the most stunning statistic about Apple. They have never had more than 20% of the global market share of the smartphone, right? That's the most iconic device of the 21st century. Routinely, they take 80% of the global profits. I mean, how is that possible? Find me another industry where a minority player commands absolute dominance. And the answer isn't just that the iPhone's an expensive product. I mean, frankly, the most expensive smartphone I'm familiar with is from Huawei, and it unfolds twice. It's like an iPhone and an iPad in one, if it were an Apple product. The reason why is that hundreds of their suppliers work for either zero margin, or in fact, even lose money at times, or they just work for 1% or 2% margins. And the reason they're willing to do that isn't just the incredible volumes that Apple creates at. It's that they are doing the Ivy League equivalent of training, of engineering training, for their factory workers to all sort of come to grips with what it is that Apple expects. So if you have that Hollywood image of Steve Jobs, who can be maniacal and obsessive, but if you can bear it, he sort of raises up the capabilities of everybody around him. The story of Apple in China is that, but through hundreds of factories across China. And I want to give great credit to the people in China, the industrial policy of China, et cetera. This is not an anti-China book. They got to where they were because they were offering things that nobody else was offering. And it really only would have happened because of those skill sets and that hardworkiness. So often it wasn't so much that Apple already knew how to build something and then they taught the Chinese. It's that the engineers would co-create something with these suppliers. And it's an important point. But then Apple would hold the intellectual property and sort of lord it over this poor supplier, if you will.
Have you seen any other country that could do what China did the last 20, 25 years? I mean,
I really like to play to the audience, right? Mexico is the...
Well,
I'd love to see it, to be clear.
No, I mean, for sure, I think Mexico can do part of it. I don't know if the scale, right? We're talking about, and I want to touch on demographics, but yeah. I mean, the demographic boom for China was 20 years ago, maybe, with a lot of policies from the government. Now we have seen a decrease, but still 1.3 billion people. But is there any other set of countries, one country that could, replace what China is doing still?
So let me come back to Mexico in a second, because I think that's an important discussion and we can probably spend lots of time talking about it. In a superficial way, the only country that can compete with China in terms of its size is clearly India. It's actually a more populous country. The wages in India are comparable to where China was 20, 25 years ago. Unfortunately, and this is, maybe I should say, this is Apple's plan right now, right? That they're ostensibly at least diversifying to India, expanding to India. They would like to say to China that they're not retreating from China, they're expanding to India. Certainly Apple doesn't use the language of de-risking or decoupling. They really can't do that. They've got too much at stake. But unfortunately, the superficial similarities are there. The differences are profound. And as much as Apple could try to copy and paste the playbook they've had over the last 25 years and do it in India, which again, I think is kind of the current plan, they're going to face three major headwinds. One is that the more successful they are at expanding to India, the more China can just tighten the screws. And we've actually already seen this in the last couple months. So Foxconn has had Chinese workers recalled from India back to China. And customs, when it understands that machinery made in China is headed to a Tata production line for the iPhone, it gets blocked. So that's Beijing in action, basically making sure that technology transfer is a one-way gate. It comes into China, it doesn't leave. Second is Apple has a gargantuan business within China, $70 billion a year of products sold in China. It's difficult to wrap your head around how big that is. There are only a dozen companies in the world that make more than 10 billion of revenue in China, and Apple's making 70 billion. And the third, the risk there is that the more that Apple is seen as the poster child of Western de-risking from China, the more that $70 billion business is at risk. There's already fervent nationalist sentiment within China to buy Huawei, Vivo, Oppo, et cetera. There have been reports that government workers aren't allowed to buy iPhones anymore, at least for business use, et cetera. And so, I think that can really be ramped up. And then the third problem is just the Apple people that I speak to that are in India just aren't convinced that the country is operating at what they used to call China speed, right, or Shenzhen speed. China's just really difficult to compete with. So even if Apple really was sending absolute plane loads of engineers to India, who's building the world-class ports? Who's building the high-speed rail? Who's building the 8-lane highways? Very difficult to do that for anyone to compete with China.
Patrick, when was the first time that you see the change on narrative in the U.S. that maybe China has been competitor in technology for the last 10 years, but now we have seen a change in the narrative. It's more than an enemy, right? It's not just a competitor. And maybe it's because pandemic, and maybe it's because the national security threat through all the new technologies that China is very good on.
Well, I can give you the answer for when Apple started noticing. I mean, I was living in Hong Kong in 2013 to 2016, and I remember my own kind of awakening was actually just reading an article that I still recommend. It's by Evan Osnos of The New Yorker. It was called Born Red, and it was about Xi Jinping. And I thought there must have been some typos in the article because it was about how many people had been purged under Xi's reign. And it was in the hundreds of thousands. And I mean, that's just an incomprehensibly large number. It was a correct number, to be clear. But so that was mind-blowing for me. But Apple had a similar kind of awakening. I mean, people might not remember, when Xi Jinping comes into power, the consensus was that he was going to be a big reformer. And in fact, his father was quite famous as a reformer and played a role in Guangdong, which is the province where Shenzhen had its big reform and opening up period, sort of capitalist experimentation. And he's actually purged as a result of sort of being such a liberal. And in the American sense, I should perhaps state. And so it takes some time to figure out that Xi Jinping is more like Putin than Deng Xiaoping. And so for Apple, who's really not that savvy in the early 2010s with how Chinese politics worked, like one kind of joke I make is that people often know Foxconn, the Taiwanese giant that Apple outsourced its production to, but they also outsourced their politicking to Foxconn. In fact, Foxconn wasn't just brilliant at making stuff. They were brilliant at sort of speaking the language, the political language of is getting support from the local cadres to build factories, to get state subsidies for machinery, to get the hands necessary for their lines by having migrant labor come from the country. The rural hinterlands. So Foxconn is this instrumental power, not just in terms of building things, but in actually sort of working the political system in Apple's favor. And they do such a good job that Apple basically remains ignorant of it. I mean, they don't have anybody living in the country that is senior, no vice presidents or anything like that, when Xi Jinping comes into power. And within 36 hours of Xi's ascent, Apple gets attacked. And they really don't understand why they're attacked. And it becomes this political awakening, this moment where they sort of realize we don't understand the culture, we don't understand the people. We've somehow become the world's biggest operator in China with the world's biggest retail business in China. And yet we fundamentally don't know why they're mad at us and what we need to do. And then sort of the narrative, in a sense, is off to the races. So to answer your question, Apple are a bunch of engineers that are flying there. They're living this Groundhog Day existence where they're not learning Mandarin on the side and pontificating about state affairs. They're just trying to ramp up the iPhone. And you remember, this goes from 5 million units in 2007 to 230 million by 2015. There is no time to do anything else. And so it takes Apple some time to realize that Xi Jinping is really taking the country in a different direction and really putting pressure on Apple to give back. And so the policy in China ends up being called In China for China. And if you sort of fast forward today, I think that's pretty equivalent to America first. And in fact, one reason, I'm being a little bit cheeky here, as to why Tim Cook is so good at placating Donald Trump, it's that he's got 12 years experience of placating Xi Jinping.
The announcement of $600 billion recently, Apple in the U.S.
So it's a nonsense figure. I mean, I should can't.
I'm gonna break the protocol in the Nerd Capital Forum very soon, and I'm gonna allow for some questions to Patrick soon. Okay, so be prepared if you want to make a question on this topic. And I don't know if we can prepare a couple of mics. Let's talk a little bit about ally shoring. You mentioned ally shoring. We brag about the U.S.-Mexico Foundation because another economist from Michigan, they started talking about ally shoring before the friendship shoring of President Biden came out. And you mentioned the alignment of China with other countries. Can you talk a little bit about those differences? The alignment of China with, North Korea and other, and then the U.S. and which countries are playing the allies of the U.S. nowadays? I mean, it looks like I don't know who is the top ally right now for the U.S.
I don't know the answer
on supply chains, and then
So I'm gonna riff on the first question you asked, which is just sometimes I get asked, well, why is it a problem that we're so dependent on high-end electronics manufacturing, or why is it such a problem that Apple's dependent on China? And of course, it's because the relationship could blow up at any day. I don't know that it will blow up, but you just think of the fact that there are two major wars going on, Ukraine versus Russia, Iran versus Israel, and there's the potential for conflict always between North Korea and South Korea. China's on the other side of all three of those conflicts. To have total and utter dependence on executing anything that comes out of Apple's portfolio every year on that country, I don't care if you're a China hawk or not. That's just a terrible idea. I mean, Supply Chain 101 would say, don't put all your eggs in one basket. It doesn't help if the basket's a surveillance state.
Yeah. And that's more, I mean, that's aligned with the de-risking, right? I mean, the first narrative was decoupling. And I think most of the people in America understood that it's going to be very hard for decoupling. Let's start playing the de-risking and not to put all the eggs in one basket, no?
Yeah, I mean, Elon Musk has a good line about it where he said decoupling would be like performing surgery on symbiotic twins. Like the likelihood is that both would die. And I agree with that. It's maybe more flagrant metaphor than I would use. But I mean, look, I think the number one policy goal in terms of supply chains for Washington should be replicating, in a sense, everything that China is capable of outside of China. And where I think the administration gets this wrong is they think America is the answer, right?
Yeah.
And I just think that's nonsense. What America, it's tougher to say that tough to say this these days, but where America really differentiates versus China is in its allies and in its ideals. And so I think the more manufacturing capacity that you have in Mexico, the more that it would actually supplement it, having it in the U.S. When there's stuff made in Mexico, it's often the case that 40% of the parts are coming from America. When it's made in China, there's really no American contributions. Maybe there's IP from Qualcomm or something like that. So the narrative just needs to be that reshoring is not in conflict with nearshoring. And the more nearshoring you have, the more it'll actually be good for America as well. So I'm okay with tariffs on China, but it just has to be one part of the toolbox rather than the answer to everything.
Do you see right now the White House moving in that direction of understanding that reshoring is not in conflict with nearshoring with other countries or ally shoring?
I would love to be wrong about this. I mean, and there's probably people in this room that are far more sort of up to date as to what's going on in the White House. But no, I don't see that. I see them pursuing a fantastical position of thinking that things really can move to the U.S. I mean, just to sort of give it some numbers, because sometimes it sounds like I'm just being pessimistic for sort of no reason. In a sense, the secret sauce of China's manufacturing capacity as it pertains to Apple is what in China is called the floating workforce. So China's census counts this type of worker. So these are people that are born in the rural areas of China, and they become temp workers by going to places like Shenzhen or Suzhou. But they're temp workers like by definition. There's actually they're discriminated against as second-class citizens within their own country. They're not allowed to settle down permanently. They can't have their children there and have them go to public school. They can't retire there. They're limited in what benefits they can get. The number of people that fall into that category is 300 million people. So what's that? Twice the population of Mexico? Good luck competing, right? It's greater than the labor force of the United States. So, to contend with just what a formidable manufacturing force China is to really quickly realize that America alone is not going to compete. So I'm a huge fan of regionalization to really tap into the network. But I mean, I would want NAFTA on steroids, right? It's like the entire Western Hemisphere in alliance, not just our three countries.
Can you talk a little bit about those industries in which China is right now at this moment better in several ways than other countries? I mean, maybe drones, for example.
Yeah, I
heard that.
Name the industry that they're not dominant in, right? The ones that I often point to, right, are that solar panels are invented in America, but 90% of them are today made in China. Smartphones, of course, is sort of closest to my analysis. 70 to 80% are made in China. Really, the only ones that aren't are Samsung, and the ones that are quote unquote made in India, but really they're just assembled there. The depth and breadth of the supply chain is overwhelmingly reliant on China. And then the other one that I think is really interesting, I mean, solar panels would be another one I already mentioned that one. The battery supply chain is so like hilariously or perhaps tragically based in China. But then the other one would be electric vehicles. And I say that because it's just sort of happening now. And part of my narrative is that if you train up hundreds of suppliers how to build smartphones, you're also training them skill sets to build smartphones on wheels, right? The sort of slang term for an EV. And Tesla ends up playing a monumental role copying the Apple model. They're actually invited by the Shanghai mayor to set up the Gigafactory in Shanghai. I think this is 2018, 2019. And the idea is, please do for EVs what Apple has done for smartphones. And so, I was a German automotive reporter at the time, and I'll tell you that there was no narrative about Chinese EVs being good or taking over the world or anything like that. Within 3-4 years of of Tesla localizing the supply chain, working with companies like CATL and BYD, suddenly those companies become world leading. Yeah. So they really adopted the Apple playbook. They actually hired a bunch of Apple people to set this plan into motion. And now they're competing against companies that are actually much larger than them in terms of their shipments. So those are the examples. So yeah. I could go through them, but I think I mentioned 4 or 5.
Last question on my end. What are your thoughts on the Chinese investment in other countries in order to...
So this is always controversial north of the border, but I found my friends in this audience, which is that I'm actually pretty supportive of Chinese investment into Mexico. I'm pretty supportive of BYD investing and making cars in Mexico. And the reason is that, in a sense, my whole narrative in the book is about Apple sending over all these engineers and training up the localized workforce to the great benefit of China. I mean, instead of just complaining about that, why wouldn't you just want to reverse the roles and do the same thing? So if Mexico can set up joint ventures where BYD is here, great. I understand there's some reasons about national security, about how much data is in a car, or perhaps that maybe not all the jobs or the value added gets done here. But the people in this room are like writing the rules for what USMCA is. So just write the rules in a way that satisfies the demands that you're looking on. But of course, once you have BYD factories here, you can change the rules if you need to. I mean, that's essentially what happened to Apple, where they get to a position where they realize they can't exit the market. Their success is their vulnerability. And so China is able to just sort of get more out of them and get them to move up the value chain within China. Right. So my argument is that Apple becomes the greatest supporter of Made in China 2025, which is this ambitious plan from 10 years ago to sever China's reliance on the West for high-end electronics and a host of other industries. Why not just do that in reverse? I think that's a great idea.
Sorry, last question. Do you see President Trump making a deal with Xi Jinping? I believe in Mexico. The fear is that we push back China in order to get along with the U.S. and with Canada to make a deal to review the USMCA. But if then President Trump makes a move with China and make an agreement on something in specific industries.
So slightly above my pay grade, but of course it overlaps with some of the issues I've been writing about and thinking about. I think Trump has been so vocal about wanting a deal that Beijing just understands they've got the leverage, because Trump really wants the sort of red carpet announcement to show the two superpowers, holding hands and so forth. And so what I would worry about is China sort of putting up big numbers, but them not being upfront capital investments, right? Something that they could renege on whenever they see fit. Yeah. And I think there's a long history of China sort of signing commitments and then not really living up to them. And as a former resident of Hong Kong, I could really point to one pertinent example of that.
Thank you, Patrick. Let's go with the public. Do you have questions?
Great to listen to you. Fantastic book. Quick comment. I think my concern with the U.S. and China is that the U.S. wants a better deal with China than that they allow Mexico or Canada to strike with China, sorry. Because they are clear that they have told us we want to be more competitive than Mexico and Canada. I think that's a fundamental mistake on what you're saying. So I do believe that it's impossible to beat China for many different reasons. Now, I don't think we have to. I just think we have to be much better integrated production in North America. Right. And my question is very simple. Do you see this North American way in Washington? Because the logic behind it, and you're just saying it is let's do this together with Mexico.
Yeah.
But I certainly don't feel we have that right now.
No, I don't either. I hope this isn't too wonky of an answer. But when I wrote a master's thesis some years ago, I sort of found these unclassified CIA documents that sort of laid out the strategy that Ronald Reagan ended up adopting. And it was basically the realization that if America really amped up its military, the Soviet Union would feel compelled to follow. And because the American economy was more dynamic and faster growing, it would just accelerate the demise of the Soviet Union were they to keep up. I often think Republicans, if not Americans in general, continue to have that sort of mentality. And my risk, and with the risk that I laid out in my thesis, was that to run the same game is to not realize that we're the Soviet Union this time, right? We're actually competing against an economy that is more dynamic, that has been faster growing for the last 4 decades. But you need to take the sort of the first principles approach that had been taken in the 1980s, which is to look at what are our capacities, what are our advantages versus China, and then how can we exploit those to our advantage, right? And so the answer that I came to, mentioned earlier, was the fact that America has more than 100 allies, China really doesn't have that many allies. They're changing that, to be clear, with the Belt and Road initiatives. But generally speaking, you're talking about Iran, Russia, North Korea. And those are all sort of precarious relationships. So that's one thing. And then I just think you got to reframe something like the border crisis. I mean, think of what a border crisis is. It's thousands of people that want to come to your country. Like, that's actually a great thing. It means that people see something of value there. China doesn't have that kind of border crisis, right? You don't have people from Vietnam fleeing in the thousands to go live in China. So there's something positive about that we could be reframing. So I would want sort of like a carte blanche, like, reframing of what the advantages are. And I think if you do that, then you get to the position that I have, or at least I've got, which is that regionalization and a better allyship with India would be a fantastic thing. But instead, Washington's doing such sort of bad decision-making that, now you've got Narendra Modi doing press conferences with Putin and Xi. So I think it's really counterintuitive. I mean, counterproductive. Someone said to me the other day that the U.S. had a policy to reshore manufacturing. And I disagreed with them. I say they have an intention to have a policy to do that, but they don't have the policy to do that. They're putting tariffs on components that you would need if you wanted to reshore in America. So they're doing lots of counterproductive things.
Pedro Casas?
Yep. Thank you. Patrick, sadly, you already kind of answered half of what I wanted to ask, and I'm not fast enough thinker to think of another question, but I already have the mic. So let's think about in 20 years, how does the global leadership look like? Are we still under a world where there's a sole leader, global hegemon, America, whatever? Is it a multipolar world, or is it a Chinese-owned world? And therefore, what's at stake for North America? What's our role then? Because the whole forum, we're here with hundreds of people, is because we all believe that we're going to be the world leaders in the next 20, 30 years. Are we dumb?
I'm so flattered that you think I know the answer to this question. I mean, does anyone have the answer to this question? The only thing I would say is that unfortunately, I'm quite pessimistic. And I want desperately someone to shake me out of my pessimism, to show me why I'm incorrect. But, China today has, I think, around 1/3 of global manufacturing capacity. And it's the United Nations that says it's going to get to 45%, I think just by the end of the decade, if I'm getting that right. That's not a helpful trajectory. I mean, that's just the next 5 years. So I don't know what changes over the years afterwards. But, I mean, I don't know of another nation that comes close to having the same Nietzschean will to power through manufacturing that China exhibits on a daily basis. And so unless you have major competitors that have the same willpower and resources, why is that going to change anytime soon? So, I mean, I hope the book, that sort of pessimistic answer, is the galvanizing force, not to overstate my influence, to make a massive change. But I think the layperson often, in a sense, doesn't understand just how formidable China is as a competitor. And again, I don't think you have to be a big China hawk to recognize what an adversary there are.
Do you see any restrictions or challenges for China?
Yeah, no, big ones.
Because we don't talk a lot about what is really happening in China. I don't know, obviously freedom and demographics and talent and I mean, a lack of immigration from other countries. What are the top restrictions that you see in China going forward?
So there are several, but unfortunately, I think for each case that I can make, you can also see how China is working to solve it. So they are facing a demographic time bomb, right? We talked about how the median age in Mexico is 30. I think that's about a decade younger than China. It is a common quip that China is going to grow old before it grows rich. Okay, but China also installed more industrial robots on the production line last year than the rest of the world combined. This is a country that is aware of the demographic time bomb and is preparing for it. So, that's not amazing. Yeah. The other thing would just be that, whatever one thinks of Donald Trump, he's certainly making the tech battle and a battle over trade an issue. I mean, supply chains are generally considered boring. I don't think I could have pitched this book in 2019. I hate to say that COVID helped, but COVID made supply chains visceral to people. I mean, most of us probably had the experience of walking into a grocery market that was bereft of items, right? And I mean, that's the supply chain. So people had that experience. Demographics was one.
You mentioned immigration. I mean, there is a lack of immigration from other countries. In China, I mean, there's no...
I had one on the tip of my tongue, but maybe I'll come back to it in a second if it comes to me.
We always talk here in Mexico that, well, yes, 30 years is the median age here in Mexico. For the US is 40, for Canada, probably 41. But when we talk about manufacturing ecosystem in the US goes up to 45, 46. In Mexico, actually goes down, right? So it's the manufacturing ecosystem is more attractive, let's say, for the talent in Mexico.
Just a quick question. Some people compare the rise of China and its manufacturing power with the United States independence regarding energy. So the US may be the largest now producer of gas and oil in the world. So that gives him a lot of leverage. China does have energy problems, which are very important. Some thoughts on that?
I mean, it really depends on the province versus the state, but Mexico versus China, China versus the US, I think I'm getting this right, that China has double the electricity capacity these days of America. If you're building up data centers for AI, if that's the future, not only is the cost of labor lower and the industrial robotics better and the refining of minerals all happening sort of on location, but it's cheaper to power all of this stuff. So I feel like America often is so putting the emphasis on inventing things, but China is better at embedding the inventions into pragmatic solutions on an everyday basis. They seem to be better at actually making AI work within the society. I'm not a big fan of Xi Jinping, but he refers to like financialization that you see in America, or the rise of Twitch streamers, gaming, and that kind of stuff as the fictitious economy. Right? He's more like a steel and furnaces kind of guy. And, that worries me because he's right about that. If there's a war, nobody wins that war, right? If there's a war over Taiwan between the superpowers, that's just bad for everybody. But you could see how China's companies, the likes of Huawei, or just the factory capacity they have, would be an insurmountable advantage, not dissimilar to how Hitler feared America's entry into World War II because of their industrial capacity. That's the position that China has now. I don't know what Facebook's going to do for us in the event of war.
Peter?
Well, Patrick, you've successfully scared the bejeebers out of all of us.
Sorry about that.
But maybe I can help you out a little bit in terms of identifying weaknesses and vulnerabilities that China has, because in spite of all of the description of their successes, one of the colossal failures of China, by its own admission, is the inability to elevate the consumer to the point where it's the dominant factor inside of the economy. So their consumption as a share of GDP is somewhere between 38 and 40%. In the average economy, it's 60. In the United States, it's 70. And so if you don't have that domestic strength to actually sustain you going forward, you've got an extraordinary dependence on international trade. So trade as a share of GDP being around 70% against the United States 26% is an incredible vulnerability to an external power exerting itself on your manufacturing base. Juxtapose that or take that at the same time as understanding there's an implosion inside of China in the key wealth element of the average household. The property sector continues to be in free fall.
Yeah.
So remedying that situation and turning China into a consumption powerhouse as opposed to a trade powerhouse isn't in the cards for the next 5, possibly 10 years, in spite of the fact that China puts this inside of its 5-year plan repeatedly. It fails to achieve what it is that it's trying to gain through that. Okay, so why why all of this context here, I throw it back to you to say, all right, in identifying this key vulnerability, there is leverage on the part of the United States and other Western governments to exert on this, given the trade vulnerability, because we are the markets that are the target markets for this trade. So I add this to the argument to say, well, how does that change your perspective on actually the Apple situation not being as much of a vulnerability, given that leverage? And how would you recommend that that leverage be used to sort of even the scales?
So I agree with you, but I would sort of flip it back to you, which is that isn't what Washington is doing with China right now by sort of trying to isolate them and all the talk about de-risking and decoupling, accelerating the very thing that you're saying China needs to do. In other words, they will create a more consumer-based society as a result of having less access to Western markets. So the thing that's going to help them out of this is something that we're pushing them to do in the first place.
Possibly. It's just a terrible time for them right now because they don't have anything of a strength of basis for building that that consumer society. They've got to do it on the back of trade. So, let me throw a hypothetical example your way. China decides that they go south on Apple and its operations there, and all the statistics that you've given us on their penetration into the Chinese market creates a Chinese dependency on Apple to keep what is of their domestic economy actually afloat. You can imagine what the scale of operation actually going down to zero immediately would do to Chinese political stability on the inside.
Oh, I don't think it would do much, unfortunately. I don't think Apple has much leverage. Apple really needs China. I don't know that China needs Apple. They certainly don't need more lessons from Apple in terms of how to build hundreds of millions of smartphones a year. They've been doing that for a decade. There's this real sense that the student has become the master. I frankly think the Chinese smartphones at the high tier are better than the iPhones. And what you'll notice is like the new iPhone is really thin, and that's pretty great. Give it till about April for every Chinese manufacturer on the planet to have their own Air version. That's basically how it works. So, I don't think Apple is unsafe, if that's the right word, in China. They like getting the lessons from Apple. But if, for whatever reason, they needed to keep Apple out of the country, I don't think it's some huge consequence. The number of people assembling Apple products on an annual basis in China is upwards of 3 million. But sometimes people use that number to say, oh, well, that's why China would never go after Apple, because 3 million people would be out of a job. None of those 3 million, I shouldn't say that. A vast majority of those 3 million people, probably around 2.5 million, are not there like throughout the year, right? These are people that are working in a place like Foxconn, supplying Apple products for a few weeks, and then they're moving on. So the number is overstated as to how many people would lose their job, but I don't think they need the lessons anymore. By the way, just partly you inspired me when I was trying to give a list of like things that were, of potential risk to China and then how they're already solving them. The other one would, of course, be that you could definitely point to the CCP maybe having a precarious hold over the population, or that as you have a rising middle class, they'll demand more rights, they'll demand more freedoms, and that would spell doom for the Communist Party. Again, the Chinese are familiar with this, Beijing is familiar with this, and so that's why you have a sort of amping up of the surveillance state, right? It's the social credit score and so forth. Your movements are restricted, your freedom is restricted, and they're doing that in such an impressive way. I use that as sort of value neutral term, that they're sort of, pushing that potential to the sidelines.
We haven't talked, and we're going to go with Sophia, but we haven't talked about Taiwan. And in Washington, I think there was consensus that at some point China will move against Taiwan. Do you see that happening?
I think it keeps Tim Cook up at night. There's a new series that's in Taiwan. It's called 0 Day Attack. I don't imagine anyone's watched it. I don't believe it's watchable outside of Taiwan at the moment. But in a sense, it was created as sort of propaganda in the good sense of making sure that like the entire 20 million or so population in Taiwan is understanding of what this threat is. If people are new to this topic, the reason why it matters so much, aside from just like, we're sort of against the territorial, someone a foreign country, taking over another country. It's the fabs, the semiconductor facilities in China. In Taiwan. If somehow the rest of the world lost access to those, but they remained humming for China, it would be, a turn of it would be such a big deal that some American officials have actually said they would rather bomb the facilities of TSMC rather than allow them to go to use towards China. I would just point out a few statistics here. 90% of semiconductors of the most advanced kind are made out of Taiwan. And Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times has said TSMC, which is $1 trillion company, is probably the first company in history that were it to stop producing, the whole world would fall into recession. I mean, this is the sort of massive importance of Taiwan. Maybe to say one other thing, I think her name was Avril Haines, National Security Advisor in America, who said that were TSMC to stop producing, the impact on global GDP would be $600 billion to $1 trillion a year for the first 5 years. So it really matters that Taiwan remains independent.
Sophia?
Thank you. Thank you for your answers. Before, I'm going to be very quickly. Recently, Bob Lighthizer was in Mexico, and he said that the only other prosperity that was important for Washington was the Mexican one, the prosperity of the people. And I think this is pretty much not the strength, but not the weakness for China, because they don't vote, so their prosperity doesn't matter at all. Then this other person, Oren Cass, was here last week, and he said that the U.S. is showing Mexico tough love or tough friendship. Either way, we are facing massive rearrangement in the labor markets, particularly in the manufacturing sector. Not only automobile, of course, there are some labor sectors which are growing, such as computer and equipment, electrical equipment, and so on. So the question would be, whether you think that actually the prosperity of Mexico matters in DC at this moment, and if you also think that exactly because the prosperity in China doesn't matter for Washington, that or for China itself, for that matter, because they don't vote, that makes us to have more or less of a leverage in the negotiation or in the review of the USMCA right now.
That's a tough question. I think what I would say is anyone, speaking to Washington needs to learn how to speak MAGA. And I would just, instead of, in other words, changing your values to just sort of placate them, I would sort of stick with your values, but learn how to frame them in a way that Washington would appreciate. So, of course, for the MAGA crowd, one of the biggest problems that they see, and really what Trump 1.0 really campaigned on, was the border issue. And so if someone can convince Donald Trump that the prosperity of Mexico diminishes the number of people that are going to have to cross the border because they're seeking opportunity, if they don't need to do that because there's iPhone assembly plants right in Guadalajara, then that's fantastic. If you've got people from Honduras who are not going through Mexico to get to the United States, but staying here because there's factories and jobs, and it's all because of a big, beautiful deal that Donald Trump can lay credit for, I think that's fantastic. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you so much for the research you have been doing for 20 years. And I think, one of the objectives of this forum is also for people to connect. So hopefully there are more conversations with you about China and Apple with the audience. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Gracias.